Hey yo, turn my microphone up for this one. Esports pools, cause you know the service rules. Fantasy contests to give you that Listerine face nasty. Betting before and in play, keep you excited and antsy. Hate a team, bet against them and hold faith as an ante. Like 'em, place the right bets and make out amply. Uh-huh. Forthcoming album maybe one day. Now, I have long been an admirer of top-level French CSGO. Not just because they've had some of the greatest teams of all time, won majors, been some of the best teams we've had in the world, but because, first of all, they've always been so stylistically driven, and so you can really get into an aesthetic and a philosophy of how they're going to play, and therefore how they put together their best lineups. And also because they've had some of the great players of all time. And so the expectation correctly should be that they should have some of the best teams in the world, teams that can challenge for the major, potentially win. And obviously, the last couple of years have been pretty rough for French CS. I mean, everyone knows, I like a bit of the old G2, Shocks, Kenny S, some of the best players of all time. But you know what? At the moment, when I watch the French CS play, I'm not happy. Not happy, actually. It's not me. That's a different guy. Funnily enough, this is actually the jersey that he got the Deagle Ace against TSM at DreamHack London, I think it was. Still on the floor, though, isn't it? So, now, one of the reasons why I think that this G2 team has been so underwhelming, because you have to realise their ceiling has been ridiculous. They're a team that has won two big events this year. ESL Pro League Season 5 finals, and then DreamHack Malmo right after the player break. Malmo certainly one of the events of the year, one of those stacked tournaments. But despite winning two massive tournaments, their actual number of times they've placed in the top four is very whack. Like at the big tournaments, beyond those two, it's basically epicenter, that's it. Otherwise, it's only tier 2 tournaments. And they make the playoffs like actually a reasonable amount of the time. And you look at how many maps they've won and how many series they've won. All the numbers are there that they should be a team where if they could deliver some level of consistency, they would be top 4 every event. They would be making 5 or 6 finals. They would have won maybe 3 or 4 events. They might not have won the majors still. They might not have been the number 1 team, but they could have put together an Astralis-esque run. But we know that this is a team that very much plays free-form Counter-Strike. And part of that is this force buy addiction. Now, admittedly, when I say I'm a big fan of French Counter-Strike, yes, it all began in CSGO with existences, Very Games and Titans squads. When you had Shocks, when you had Kenny S, when you had Shocks, back and forwards. When you had Kenny S, you had them both twice. And these different lineups generally played a very structured game and played a very tactical game and tried to get onto the same maps and to master those maps. They were much more like a North type team or an Astralis type team than the G2 we see before us. G2 now is something akin to what FaZe is now, is something in the vein of obviously the Envious team that won the 2 majors, the 2 different lineups. But the Envious teams that won the majors, the second one started to go down the hill very soon, and that's because when your best player is Kenny S, and he is an AWPer, when you are force buying as much as that team did, and as this team does, it is gonna impact your consistency. You're not gonna have your best player on his best weapons. He's not gonna have the most impact. You're gonna win less games. You're gonna be putting yourself in a lot of risk in close games. You're gonna be taking games that were runaways and giving opponents a chance back in the door. And as a result, you think of all these factors, all these possible outcomes of being a force buy heavy team, and it's going to lead to massive inconsistency. It's going to mean when it works and then you force buy, you're going to be up in a game. The opponent might have a window back in, but you just crash him flat immediately and reset him instantly the second he has guns, and you just win massively. That'll happen occasionally. If you were very good, it happened a lot, and you could be like FaZe and just dominate and roll over tournaments. But if you're not as good as FaZe, as G2 aren't, you're going to just do it occasionally. And yes, sometimes you're going to look excellent. You're going to win. But you know what? You're going to have games where you would have ground out these games or won in a really tough match that's back and forth with a really key decision. But instead, you're going to force buy there. And how many times is it going to work out for you? It's going to work out a few. But again, because it's so risky, most of the time it's not going to work out again because you're not FaZe. And by the way, even FaZe actually in those scenarios aren't actually as good late in games when they do it the really risky ones. They tend to dominate with them early. In fact, the funny is they work so often early that therefore they only get into the late game scenarios when they haven't worked, and therefore the games are going badly and they tend to lose those games. Actually, they lose a lot of close games. So you look at this scenario, and actually G2 is exactly where they should be. They're a team that can hover around sort of 5th to 8th, depending on what month it is, still always have a shot of having that miracle tournament. You know, one tournament out of every 5, say, they could win. But other than that, they're not going to make top 4. Other than that, they're maybe going to make playoffs in half of them, but not go further and maybe get underwhelmed. They're going to have some big map wins over top teams. They're going to also lose to some shocking teams as well. And part of this comes down to economical management, which plays into philosophy of how you're going to manage the game, which then plays into which players do you choose to play with, what composition, in what roles do you use them all from. Because for me, it all stems from this. And even though they got rid of Happy, who, yes, because he individually had fucked up his own game and as an in-game leader was massively less effective, coupled with all of the force buying was crippling them, they've still kept over sort of elements of the virus because they've kept the force buying element, even though they've got a better team, a more varied team, and a team that could go many different approaches and many different routes to success and doesn't have to be such a streaky team in this sense. They need to go more back towards the structured Counter-Strike without having to embrace it entirely. There are times it works. So if you want to talk about the force buys that G2 have, so obviously, a big topic surrounding this where the narrative really got set, because we already knew they force buyed for all the time before anyway. But the difference is, G2 prior to the player break was a team that largely was inconsistent in the most detrimental sense. Like, for example, they won a small tier 2 tournament in DreamHack Tours, but then they didn't win DreamHack Austin and kind of got upset by a Gambit team that had no business really beating them at that point in time. Then you go and look, okay, they got rocked out by FaZe in a war at the first LAN they had, Star Series. Then you go, okay, Matt, everything comes together. They beat SK, they win EPL, great. Then they go to ESL Cologne, underwhelming, lose to Na'Vi, who wasn't very good. They go to PGL Krakow, don't even make it to out of the Swiss system to the round of 8. So when it works, when everything goes perfectly, yeah, they can do really well. But the majority of times it doesn't. Let's say 2 out of 3 times, let's say 3 out of 4, whatever. You see them getting the underwhelming results and they don't get the map wins they need, they don't get the series wins they need, and they don't get the results that they need for a team that has this caliber of players and at their ceiling looks so good. So the problem with this equation is, let's look at G2 after the player break. And now you'll see that the killer is Malmo, because Malmo was one of the most stacked events of the year. It was one of the best events of the year, one of the best formats of the year, where you had to win a best of 3 to get out of the group no matter what, in the winners match or in the decider. Then it had an 8-team single elim bracket, which I love. And then we had all the top teams there pretty much. So winning that tournament was so big, and the way they won it made you think maybe they've cracked something. Because what happened was they got out of their group, not a particularly tough group. They got into the round of 8 and they were playing against SK Gaming. Obviously the best team in the world at that point in time, the number 1 ranked team. This was the first event after the player break. And you looked at SK Gaming, and SK Gaming almost 2-0'd them. On the second map, it was Inferno. SK Gaming was in position to win with a big lead. SK had won all the pistols in that series. And basically, G2 was just going to get eliminated in the round of 8, and it would have been more of the same. Like, okay, did all right, but just went out round of 8, still got a lot to work on. But what happened was, they had this crazy series from Apex who absolutely blasted the doors off. And despite the fact they won none of the pistols over these 3 maps, Apex helped them do a mad comeback on Inferno, then do a comeback on the decider. They won the series. They later went on. They beat NIP, who was a surprise semi-finalist, but they beat them in the semis. North was kind of a shock. Their new lineup with Valde had made the final, but they easily took care of North. And so they won the tournament off the back of that. But when you consider, in many senses, the game against SK shouldn't have gone that way. SK probably should have won 2-0. Apex wouldn't go as ham. If he even just went 10% less ham, 5% less ham, they don't win that series. They get 2-0'd. Then in that world, we never get to see anything beyond that round of 8 match. And so G2 is still the same G2 we know. And in fact, what they've done since would have made a lot more sense. Because as people might remember, because they didn't win any pistols, after the tournament, Smiths, their coach and former player, said that because they weren't winning any pistols, they decided not to go with mad force buys all the time, and instead to save a little bit more. So they then went on, you looked at their other playoff series against NIP, against North. They did play a much more disciplined economical management strategy. They did do some key saves at some key moments. And so the fact that they won like that makes you think, why don't they do this all the time? Why don't they lean more towards that? Why don't they skew more towards that? It would seemingly have more success, because Malmo was a massive part of their success. But even so, take Malmo out of the equation, force buys are still back all over the equation. And in fact, put Malmo in the equation, as I said, probably in many ways would have never got to even try that experiment. Haven't tried it really since as much. And if you actually go back, they didn't really try as purely as it seemed at the time. On the key rounds, they did some great moves. But actually, first of all, they did force buys even in Malmo when you go and look at the tournament later on. They actually had some key that they did. They did some when they were up against North. They did some when they were down against NIP. They had certain moments where they were willing to pull off these force buys. So even then, they didn't really commit to it even in the experiment. That might just be a narrative they're shaping for themselves, even if they did save a little bit more, not forcing so many ridiculous scenarios. Part of the problem for G2 is that actually they don't even go to the stylistic lengths of being pure. They don't actually force consistently or save consistently. There's not even necessarily a great rhyme or reason, which to me is a great omen that the leadership problem is still there in G2 because they don't have a great in-game leader. Shox is doing his best. He's a good player. He's got a very intuitive feel for the game. He's trying to study it. He's trying to work with MBK and NKJ to get some analysis and then interpret it in the game. He's having to learn a lot. He's not the guy who puts in the 15 hours as he's talked about with people like Existence, who he admires. But the problem is, you can see there's not as much rhyme or reason as to when they force, because they will force sometimes when they're up big, when they're almost certainly going to win the game if they just played economically safe. They will force when they're down big, because they want to get back in the game desperately. They're not willing to believe they can force back in. But worst of all, they will force without real good rhyme or reason in the close games, in the 13-13, in the 12-14 down, in the 14-14 game. The ones that really are about execution, about a couple of good rounds. Yes, individual plays will affect it because it's only a few rounds, but generally you want your overall approach to be consistent and to be the one that's right for you, your team composition and your style of play to have the best chance of winning there. And that is where they fall down the most. I can criticize the other ones in their own ways. If you actually had very good gun rounds and a great AWPer, you want to get him onto an AWP when you're down big and let the gun rounds rack up and roll over, especially when you got a deep map pool like they do. If you're up big, you want to play an economically safe approach and generally just let the opponents do what they're going to do. You keep getting all your guns, make sure you have 4 or 5 good cracks at closing the game out, close it out big. Therefore, you're going to win a lot more maps and never let people have a little foot back in the door when you lose a few big forces. But these ones that they do in the close moments are the ones that kill them. Now, this willy-nilly approach, but general force buys in all respects, shows out in their maps. Like, they've played 38 maps from Malmo to Blast Pro Series. And of those 38 maps they've played, they've won 8 of them in dominant fashion. And I counted dominant fashion as don't let the opponent get to double-digit rounds, which isn't 100% pure, because if the opponent starts on CT side nuke and you start T side, it's probably going to get double-digit rounds. But generally, those are outlier conditions. In 38 maps, there have only been 8 times that G2 managed to win in dominant fashion. So only 21% of the time, basically just over a fifth of the time, G2 wins in dominant fashion. And that's against all levels of opponent, against Renegades, against Optic, but against SK, against FaZe, against Astralis. Only 8 times, so a fifth of the time. So if you're force buying a lot, it's not leading to you winning dominantly many times. How many of those 38 maps did they lose in close fashion? So I'll say that's when they get double-digit rounds themselves and they lose the map. So of the 38 maps they played, all their wins and losses, 8 of them they have lost in close fashion. 28%, 21% of the time. Again, a fifth of the time they are losing those games. So yeah, the force buy is giving them the dominant wins a fifth of the time. It's also costing them a fifth of their games. Now, remembering that the dominant wins don't really do anything for you. Winning 16-10 versus winning 16-3 because you had a massive half and then you did a key force even if they won the pistol back doesn't really help you. A win's a win. Whereas winning those, taking back those 8 close losses where you've done force buys and that's actually just granted victory to the opponent and snowballed the game against you, those would be really big because you would get to keep most of the dominant wins anyway, just as wins, but you'd get back some of the other ones. And these few wins get you more series. That means to more top 4s, get you into more finals, potentially win you more tournaments, get you into the playoffs almost every time if you're a team of G2's level that's already making the playoffs a decent amount of the time. So now we got to look at their force buys. One of the problems with their force buys is their force buys aren't as good as they need to be for the amount that they do it. Like, FaZe can get away with it because FaZe are outrageously good at force buys against so many teams. The problem G2 has is, now they're pretty good at aggressive CT force buys. And even then, only on certain maps. So, okay, Overpass, a map that's been up and down for them, that's part of why, because they're good at CT aggressive force buys. Cash is a map where when you consider the skill of the lineup, of course they should be good on Cash. They are decently good on Cash. They don't play it as much as others, but it's mainly aggro CT force buys. You remember at Malmo, they had a couple of those that were big. Then you go On Cobble, they can do it on either side. That's why actually Cobble, they were very good at earlier in the year, and they've been pretty consistent throughout. It's just that obviously a couple of top teams, FaZe and Astralis, ban it. But otherwise, they're playing this. They're doing well on it. Their problem is, outside of those 3 maps, they still force buy all over the place. Their T-side force buys are actually fairly weak. They're not very constructive. Generally, they're a team where even a force buy for them needs to oftentimes, if it's not going to have coordinated aggression on CT side, if it's a T-side, they need to have 3 rifles still somehow. So it's not even then even a full... like just a force, because I often think of a lot of the forces as like you have like the 3 pistols and you maybe have 1 AK or a Galil or something. A lot of these are almost just gun rounds, and you may be playing it more like the Neo and Na'Vi lineups in 1.6 where you just send the good players first and then you trade off the guns by having people pick them up behind you. You kind of get to piggyback or hand me down and grandfather a weapon to someone else in a sense. Now, one of the reasons why their force buys don't work that often, especially the T-side ones. So first of all, on T-side, they don't often use a coordinated aggression. On CT side, they just play default spots a lot of the time. They have the guns and they think they're going to have a long-range CZ headshot on someone, but they're not that great. Now, funnily enough, when they go to the key rounds, the risky rounds, they're losing most of these rounds. You go back and you look, go back and watch any game that's like a 13 rounds, 12 rounds, 14 rounds for G2 and find one they lost and then go and look at the force buy decisions. Those force buys aren't working, especially the force buys that are the really risky ones, the really low econ ones, the desperation ones. Those aren't working for them at all. They're not getting the FaZe type amazing turnaround wins. Now, funnily enough, their force buys coupled with pistol round losses are just killing their halves entirely. Because when they lose pistol rounds, they're not the best pistol round team. They're an all right one. When they then do their forces, those aren't actually very good. Now, funnily enough, they have found a force that works actually pretty decently after they lose pistol, which is when they do the Deagle no armor. So it's not really a full force. It's just a low econ buy. And even then, it's not really that. It's just a pistol, right? I wouldn't even call it a low econ entirely. It's just playing around a pistol. And that works when they just buy Deagles. Deagle, no armor, maybe Apex with armor and Deagle, that's it. When they do that, because you can play long range, because you can duck back because you got a Deagle, because you don't have to play coordinated CT aggression and play up close and tag people, which you can do, it works for them in many respects. But you know what? They don't go to that often. That's not their main go-to force. That's not the force that they're doing in the key risky moments late in games. Now, the reason why it's tilt-worthy is because actually G2 has effective full buys. First of all, because their best player is an AWPer, is Kenny S. So having your best player in AWPer can give you consistency, especially when he's the best AWPer in the world, can give you something to base around, can give a structure to your team. You're trying to move your AWPer onto sites, or you're trying to have him pick off someone and give you information to then attack a site. This is all great stuff to build a T side around. So they have really effective buys. Likewise, CT side, they have effective holds when they do this. Some of their force buys even work CT side. So that actually sometimes works for me, even though I'm generally not a fan of a lot of CT force buys because it kills your economy and can kill your AWPer's economy. Now, generally, that's not been as big an issue, but they're not getting as many rounds out of the AWP as they should. Now, one thing I will say is quite smart is they've taken a different approach to knowing that Kenny S is their best player, which is that oftentimes they will have Shocks who, yes, I wish would be a star player and an amazing rifler, but as an in-game leader, he has consigned himself to not being a star, and as such, he does try to take care of the economy for Kenny S. Like, you'll see him using an MP9. Sometimes Kenny S even drops him an MP9 to do this. He then farms up using his great mid to close range skills, a bunch of kills and money, and then he is the one who, from his saves and using MP9s, gives Kenny S that AWP to ensure that Kenny S has an AWP. So actually, when you go back and watch the games, they're not actually limiting too much the AWP when they have their full buys. They're not doing too many full buys where they have to just give Kenny S an M4 or an AK and say, well, it's a full buy. Sorry, mate. Even if you're the best on the AWP, you have to have this. No, they are getting him the AWP. They have found a way around that. It's just that the force buys themselves are killing them, and they're not waiting to let these effective full buys give them the wins. You even look at the opponents they've won and lost against. And funnily enough, okay, so they've lost against a big gamut of players, but there's certain teams they've done amazingly well against. They've done fantastically well against North, Astralis, NIP. They've also done pretty well, obviously, against the SK with Phelps. So you think about these teams, okay, North and Astralis, two of the most structured teams in the game. NIP, using Threat in his timeouts, yeah, fairly structured, fairly set in terms of the roles they're going to play. SK, admittedly, with Phelps, that was more of a raw team. That was more of a team that's going to go head-to-head with a lot of damage. Yeah, they got the set roles, but Phelps was that big X factor in the equation, right? And Fallen wasn't as heavy a hitter. So what's bizarre is they've lost to all kinds of teams. They're like SK, Na'Vi, Immortals. These are teams they've beaten who play a really heavy individual skill style and a really streaky style. Then you go and look, but they've beaten the structured teams, North, Astralis. Then you go back and you look who they've lost to. So they've lost to both SKs, they've lost to FaZe, they've lost to Astralis, even with Dennis, they've lost to Cloud9, they've lost to Virtus.pro. They lose to every type of team. They beat both types of teams. So there's not even consistency in terms of who they win and lose against. Not like you can just say, they lose against teams that just play like them, are really like a war of attrition, fighting a phone box, like we're both force buying, we're both playing eco, we're both playing super aggro. No, they don't just lose to those teams. They beat those teams and lose to them. They don't just lose to teams that are really structured. Actually, they've got a lot of wins against structured teams. But then again, also, wins against structured teams are the ones who don't force buy as much, are they? So in some senses, perhaps their force buys are more effective against the Norths and Astralis of the world who don't like the force buys themselves and actually aren't that great at defending against them if you've gone and had a look, to be honest. So the force buy addiction for G2 is real. Now, the problem with it is, it's not even just that they're doing it. Like, I'm not someone who thinks they should cancel all force buys. Certainly, I think they should skew away because they've got Kenny S. I certainly think when you look at how deep their map pool is and how good generally they still manage to get decent placings and sometimes win, I think they should skew against it because even those 3 or 4 more maps won is a couple of series more, is a couple of more advancements in the tournament to get further, to play more, is a few more playoff series. So I think they would be a much greater team as a result. But they've got to at least be more consistent with it. They've got to figure out the philosophy, Shocks, Kenny S, and KJ, of when they force buy, how they do it. Yes, you can do the odd one as a surprise to keep the opponent off guard. But as a general, when you're talking about 38 maps, there's got to be a philosophy here. Generally, those really risky ones late in games aren't working. Yes, they can limit some of the ones when they're up. There's no point in giving even opponents a chance there. They probably shouldn't do it as much when they're down. That's not making as much logical sense, and they are losing like a fifth of their games without getting to double digits, and this is part of the reason why. But in general, they're doing okay managing Kenny S with the op. This is just an area where they can tweak it without a roster change, without having to bring in a new coach, without having to overhaul things, without having to radically change the map pool, which is already pretty good. Everything else is in place. This is a tweak that can make G2 a better team.
Hey guys, Memphis here. Just a friendly Canadian reminder to keep force buying, and you're watching Thorin's YouTube.